Today we'll be painting this, and resisting dad jokes about juicy pears. Oh, it's too late. In this tutorial we'll also introduce the concept of glazing, the process of creating layers of paint to build up detail and change the colour, depth or tone. This is a very simple introduction to glazing. There's no video that could cover everything about glazing ever without being a bit overwhelming. The point of this tutorial is to give you a good understanding of the technique by getting you to use it as quickly as possible, with repeatable results. We'll start with a quick breakdown of the technique. 3 steps to the perfect glaze. Number 1. Use paints that are as transparent as possible after your first layer. One of the main benefits of glazing is that it changes the colour values. Take a look at this glazing chart and you'll see how the colour values are affected when the paints are layered up. So it makes sense to work with paint that's as transparent as possible. If it's not transparent, then you won't benefit from the layering because you won't be able to see the previous colour through the one that you're painting. How do you know how transparent paints are? Look at the back of the tube and you'll see this symbol. Full is very opaque, empty is very transparent, and half full is semi-transparent. If you want to make a glazing chart for yourself, we've got a tutorial for that. I know, we're spoiling you. You love it. Remember, these are not mega strict live or die rules. I'm sure sometimes you'll want to paint opaque paints over transparent ones. The important thing here is to understand how to achieve the effect that you're going for. Number 2. Wait for the paint to dry properly before adding a new layer. Pretty obvious, right? But if you're painting over wet paint, then the colours are just going to mix together and not result in a glaze. You can use a hairdryer to speed up the drying process. Some people frown on this technique, and if you go crazy and really cook the painting, you can end up causing some strange stuff to happen. So just exercise a little bit of restraint. Number 3. Don't apply a ton of pressure when glazing, or scrub the paper too much. You'll end up disrupting the dried layer of paint, or causing the paper to pile up like this. And neither of these things is very good. Okay, let's get painting. Start by finding this template in your Chromatek tutorial pad, or download the template from the description below and print it on watercolor paper. Tape it to the board, stretch it if you like. The tutorial for stretching watercolor paper is also linked in the description. Here's the photo reference for this painting. I'd love to be able to give you the image to download, but we licensed it from Shutterstock, so I can't. But here's a full screen so you can take a screenshot, or the link to the watermarked version is in the description. Now take a good look at the reference image and identify the different areas of tone and colour. At its most basic, in terms of tone, you have highlights, midtones and shadows. And in terms of colour, there's a lot going on. Yellows, greens and browns. I'm going to take a little bit of artistic license with the colours, since I don't particularly like the background and I want the pears to be roughly the same colour. There's no need to make things more complicated than they already are. Here are the colours I'm going to use. They're mostly transparent with a few semi-transparent ones in there and one opaque one. But since they're all going to be mixed and diluted a lot with water, all of them are going to work fine. Firstly, I'll mix up the colour we're going to use for the base layer. I want a pear yellow colour, so I'm going to mix yellow and ochre. It's really useful to try the paint out on a spare piece of paper first to make sure you have the right colour and transparency that you want. If you're short on paper, then you can always use the back of one of your previous test paintings. There, that's about right. Start with a thin wash of water. For this layer, I don't think there's any need to paint the pears separately. Make sure the paper's just damp and not wet. If there's any pooling of water, then the paint will bleed into it, and you won't be able to blend properly or create the sense of dimension that we're going for. If you end up with too much water on the paper, you can always dry off your brush with tissue, and then use the brush to pick up the excess. Layer 1. Get some of that pear yellow mix and paint in the rough shape of the pears, avoiding the highlight areas. Wash and dry the brush and then blend where necessary. You're not just colouring in the pear, you're also creating the tonal value which suggests the dimensionality of the pear. The first wash should be lighter than you think. Remember, this is just a base layer and shouldn't look like a completed painting, so it won't be very bright or saturated. This technique of creating a monotone base layer is often referred to as underpainting. As you'll notice, I'm also painting the stalks of the pears here with the base colour too. Once you're satisfied with this layer, then leave the painting to dry thoroughly before moving on. Layer 2. Add permanent green along with more mid-yellow and ochre to the original mix, and test it until you have the right degree of transparency. Start by painting water where you want to continue painting. In this case, the area of midtones and shadows that we identified at the beginning. Throughout this process, use a light touch to avoid scrubbing the previous layer or making the paper pile up. Start by adding paint to the darkest areas. Clean your brush, remove most of the water from it with a piece of tissue, and then blend the paint towards the lighter areas. You can always add more of the mix to the dark areas to create more depth if necessary. What you're going for is a smooth blend from dark to light. There's no need to oversaturate this layer with colour since we'll be adding another glaze after this one. Each glaze just adds a little bit more depth and colour. Let this layer dry thoroughly before starting on layer 3, or use a hairdryer to speed up the process. Layer 3. Mix in Hooker's green with a little bit more deep green, yellow and ochre and test. This will be the darkest colour that we use on the pears. Then use the same process as the previous glaze to paint a thin layer of water where you're going to add the shadows. Switch to the small brush to paint in the darkest shadow first. After cleaning and drying the brush, and using the paint that's already on the paper, gently dab it like this to spread it into the lighter areas in a stippled way. This watercolour technique, which produces a dappled look, is called scumbling. So now when you hear all the cool kids talking about scumbling, you won't feel left out. You can always add more water if needed. Just be careful not to add too much. A good way to control how much water you add is to wet the brush and then dab most of the water off on tissue. You can also add more of the dark paint where necessary. Continue using this technique to add paint all the darkest areas of the pears. Once you're happy with the result, leave the painting to dry. Then, using the same process, add a little water over here and then blend in a tiny little bit of crimson and vermilion paint. And now we'll paint the stalks. Add a thin layer of water to the stalks with the small brush and paint them with a mix of burnt umber and black. Do this in a couple of stages, firstly with a lighter mix and then with a darker mix. You can see I've also painted water a bit further onto the pear than necessary. I've done this so the paint will bleed into it a bit and soften the join between the pear and the stalk. Now it's time to add some dots to the pear. Scientific name, pear freckles? I've used some burnt umber and ochre mix I had left over from another painting for this. We could paint them by hand, but let's face it, that would take ages. On a larger scale painting I think it would be worthwhile, but this is pretty small and getting that kind of detail with a brush would be hard. So flicking the freckles on there is definitely the best option. Using a toothbrush is a great way to do this, but if you're going to use somebody else's, just make sure you ask before you do it. Or perhaps best just use an old toothbrush. Either way, you can actually use your flat brush for this too. Just hold it sideways and flick it like this. I'd practice a bit on a spare piece of paper first, just to make sure you don't go all Jackson Pollock on it and end up with a crazy mess. Once you've put the freckles on the pears, then use a tissue to dab them off and it will make them slightly transparent and varied. Just be careful not to brush them sideways, as this will create streaks across the paper. Any rogue freckles that ended up on the background can be lifted off with a little bit of water really easily. I guess if you were really going for perfection, you could have masked off the pears somehow, but I don't feel that's necessary. Now your pair of pears is looking amazing, hopefully. And they're basically finished. But one thing that will definitely make this painting really pop is adding a background. I experimented with a few different colours, but ultimately found that this blue worked best for me. If you want to take it in a different direction, then go for it. Firstly, make sure your painting is completely dry. Then mix up some Prussian blue, cerulean, and a tiny bit of black. Start by adding that thin wash of clean water to the painting, taking care not to go over the edges of the pears. There's no need to paint the water around the bottom of the pears, as this is where the shadow will go later. Then outline them with the blue paint. Add a few bits here and there to give it a bit more of a random, mottled look. Then blend out to the edges of the paper. Once you're happy with the background, then darken the paint mix down with a bit more Prussian blue and black, and add a clean water wash under the pears and paint with this mix. Try to avoid blending the paint too far. Add more of the mix to the area directly under the pears if necessary. Clean and dry the brush and then blend the edges slightly to smooth things out. You can see here I'm adding a little bit more shadow as I go as well. Well, there you have it, a freckly pair of pears painted using watercolor glazing. Hopefully your painting looks a little bit like this. If it doesn't and you've made a total mess of it, then really don't sweat it. These techniques take a little bit of practice to get right, and the more often you try them, the better you're going to get. Don't forget to subscribe. My sense of self-worth is 100% linked to the number of subscribers we have, so it does mean a lot to me. I really hope you've enjoyed the tutorial, and if you have any questions or suggestions, then just drop them in the comments below, and we'll do our best to get back to you. As always, thanks for watching and sending happy vibes from Japan.